Hello YouTubers, Alaska Prepper here. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to go over 3 numbers with you that will have a direct effect on your standard of living, on how well you can live your lives going forward. Specifically, if you live here in the United States. However, these same 3 numbers will affect you no matter where you live, what country you live in. It's just you have to look at those numbers in perspective to your country. But here we're going to be talking about the United States. Now take a look at this right here. Now I'm only going to read this very small part right here, and then I'm going to go over these charts with you, because trust me, stay for this, because this is very important. This is how you can gauge what the health of our actual financial system, i.e. economy, whatever you want to call it, is. And trust me, no matter what part of the socioeconomic level you're at or economic ladder you're at, it will affect you. It will affect everyone. Welcome to the death spiral, and that is what we're entering to in this monetary system. Eventually, they will have no choice but to bring us into a new one, and that is why we need to be prepared, so that when we're transitioning to that new monetary system, you can make it through and still be strong on the other side, instead of being with your hands out, expecting a handout because you lost everything. This gives you a chance to preserve what you have now and to get prepared for what is coming. It's inevitable. Before we begin, I want to say thank you very much to Genesis Gold Group for sponsoring this video. So let's get started. Gold bugs and other long-suffering critics of fiat currency and endless credit expansion have for decades been predicting that soaring debt would eventually blow up the financial world, and eventually it will. And the one thing that I have to maybe partially disagree with that statement is soaring debt. It's really not so much the debt, but the interest payments on that debt. As long as there is confidence in a currency, in a fiat currency, you don't really have to worry about the debt so much. What you have to worry about is the interest payments that you have to make on that debt. I hope that you follow me on that. So meaning that as long as there's confidence in the US dollar worldwide, we can continue to borrow all we want, right? But we have to be able to maintain, all right, to service that debt by keeping up with interest payments, right? As the story went, governments with unlimited printing presses would spend and borrow too much, forcing their central banks to keep interest rates unnaturally low to make interest costs manageable. See, that there goes to my point. The lower that they keep the interest rates, the more they can borrow, because they know that they can never pay back the debt. But what they have to make sure is that they can service that debt with the interest payments that go along with it, which would encourage even more credit growth, causing inflation to spike and so on. We've seen this happen in front of our eyes for the last few years, until everyone loses faith in fiat currencies and the misbegotten things fall to their intrinsic value of 0, which fiat currencies always end up falling to what they really are valued at, and that's just a piece of paper with ink on it, and that's it. Thank you, Genesis Gold Group, for sponsoring this video. Ladies and gentlemen, I've received several emails in the past asking me what I would do if I had a 401k or an IRA that I wanted to protect against the inflationary forces that we've experienced and are experiencing now. I'm not a financial advisor, but the folks at Genesis Gold Group specialize in helping those who want to diversify their excess wealth by converting their fiat currency retirement plans into a plan that is backed by real money. So if you're in a position where you are wondering what you can do in order to diversify or insulate your wealth against what I like to call the inferno of inflation, give Genesis Gold Group a call, and they can provide you with the information that you need in order to make an educated decision. Once again, thank you very much, Genesis Gold Group, for sponsoring this video. So now I want to go ahead and show you 3 charts that have 3 numbers on them, and these 3 numbers are the ones that are the most important numbers to your standard of living, ladies and gentlemen. And the first one that I want to go over with is the national debt. And in my opinion, I'm not an economist by any measures, but I'm just a layman, a simple person, just like every one of you watching, more than likely, all right? I'm not even that very well educated. I have a 2-year degree as far as college goes, and it's in general education. So I went to high school for an additional 2 years. But you can take a look here. This is the national national debt, which is nearing $32 trillion. Well, you often hear pundits talk about the debt doesn't really matter. We can continue to borrow as much as we want. But what the reality is that we can continue to borrow as long as someone's willing to buy the bonds that the government is selling because they need to borrow money. So whenever the government sells let's say $100 bond, they're selling a $100 bond at whatever percentage rate, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%. Someone is buying that bond with the promise that the government is going to repay them that bond plus whatever interest they accrued over the time that they held it. Right? So that doesn't really affect the debt too much because the government, as long as people are buying bonds or institutions are buying bond, i.e. the Federal Reserve, all right, as long as institutions or people are buying bonds, they can continue to borrow as long as they can make that interest payment because the people still have faith in the dollar. If they didn't have faith in the dollar, they wouldn't be buying those bonds, right? So that's that. I hope that makes sense. So if we can see around the world, a lot of countries have been selling off their U.S. bonds. China recently, they sold off about $200 and something billion worth of U.S. bonds. First time in a very long time that China's U.S. dollar holdings or U.S. dollar holdings in bonds has been less than $1 trillion. Japan, not too long ago, because of the surge of the dollar, they had to sell off a whole bunch of bonds, a couple $100 billion as well, in order for them to keep their heads above water. And now with all of these BRICS nations, or all of these nations that are wanting to join the BRICS, or the BRICS Plus, they are not needing to have as much US dollars in reserve because they are trading bilaterally. So what does that mean? That means that faith in the dollar is being lost little by little. But let's say that faith in the dollar was great. That the faith in the dollar was great and we can continue to borrow forever. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the second number that you need to take a look at is the interest rate. So the higher that the national debt goes, right, that's fine as long as we can manage and pay the interest on it is fine. So the national debt can go on forever, right? But we have to pay interest on it. So if you take a look at the 10-year bond, it's going up. Actually, the interest on everything is pretty much going up. Right now, we're like in an inverse curve as far as interest rates go, which means that like the 3-month and the 6-month, the 1 year and the 5-year, they're higher in interest than the 30-year, the 20-year and the 10-year, which doesn't make too much sense. That tells me that people are starting to lose confidence in the government's ability to pay them back. Because if you were going to borrow money, right, or if you were going to lend someone money for 30 years, wouldn't you want a higher interest rate than if you were going to lend them money for 1 month or 3 months? It just makes sense that if you're going to lend someone money for 3 months, that the interest rate that you will be collecting would be a lot less than if you were going to lend them money for 30 years. Think about this. Right now, the 30-year bond is at less than 4%. I think it's like 3.69%, something like that. 3.69% on your money over 30 years means that you would have probably lost half of that money to inflation alone. So it doesn't make very much sense. But the point of this is that the U.S. Treasury yield is going up, and they are going to continue to go up. I believe they're going to continue to go up, even though they've been going down a little bit. Is that it takes a lot more money, a lot more capital in order to maintain that interest rate or the interest payments on our loan. And I'm going to show you what it's looking like here in a minute as far as how much interest we have to pay on our loan. All right. And some people would argue that, well, the interest payments go right back to the Treasury. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you this question, all right? And this is just me thinking out loud. Let's say that you borrow or that you lend the government $1,000 because you bought $1,000 worth of bonds, let's say at 3%. When you turn that bond in to the government, aren't you getting that interest? So how is it that that interest is going back to the Treasury? Isn't the person or the entity that loaned the government that money getting that interest? So ask yourself that question, because I've heard that a lot, that all of the interest payments that go into our, into our debt, they get paid right back to the Treasury. But then what about the person that lent the government the money? Aren't they getting paid that interest? I've had government bonds before, long time ago. I had a whole bunch of government bonds. And when I cashed them in, I got my principal back plus the interest that they owed me. So I don't understand how people say that whatever we pay in interest just goes right back to the Treasury. So anyways, I digress. So the higher that this number goes, the higher that the number on the interest that's being paid for those bonds or for the money that was loaned to the government goes, the more interest we're going to pay. Meaning what, ladies and gentlemen? Meaning that that's going to come out of our bottom line. So if the government collects 4.6, let's say $5 trillion a year, but we have to pay $1 trillion in interest, that means that that $5 trillion they collected in taxes now is $4 trillion because they had to make those interest payments. And what is that going to affect? It is going to affect your standard of living. Why? Because where does the government get its money from? It gets it from we the people. So the more indebted that the government becomes, the higher the interest rates, because the cost of borrowing is higher, the more money that the government's going to have to take from us. But AP, the government can just print that. They can just have a deficit and print that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, whenever a deficit is created, that means that money was printed out of thin air and put out into the economy, put out into the system. And what does that create? When you inflate the money supply, what happens? A symptom of inflation is prices of everything going up. So we're going to pay for it one way or another. So the national debt, along with the interest that we pay on that national debt, certainly affect your standard of living going forward. Now take a look at this chart, ladies and gentlemen. This chart tells you where we are presently on how much we are expending on just paying back interest for our national debt at these interest rate levels. Between 800 and 900 billion dollars a year. Yes, you heard that right. We are now paying on interest more than what we are spending, if not pretty close to what we are spending on defense. How long do you think this is going to go on? Right? How much more do you think that other nations are going to need to see that eventually we won't be able to pay back our debts because there's just not enough cattle, i.e. people, to work and pay taxes? There's only so many taxes that the government can collect before the people say, no, we've had enough. People can't even afford to put food on the table nowadays. The food banks are overrun. Even though they came out with a jobs number that says, oh, we had a great job number. Do you really believe that? Do you really believe that we have such a great jobs number when more than 50% of Americans can't even afford a $400 emergency? Where more than 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck? Where children are, well, not children, but young adults are actually moving back home because they can't afford to pay for an apartment? Where they're having their parents pay for their utility bills or pay for their food or even pay for their rent? Do you really think that the unemployment level or the actual full employment level is as low as they say that it is? They are just giving the general public these numbers because the general public can't check into these numbers and figure out for themselves that they are being hoodwinked into working 2 or 3 jobs just to keep their heads above water, ladies and gentlemen. And just like this article says, the annual interest rate payment on government debt is $850 billion, and it is raising fast. You know why? Because interest rates are still rising. And for those of you that think that the Federal Reserve actually controls the interest rates, it's not. It's the debt market. The only way that the Federal Reserve can really control the interest rates is if they buy the excess bonds that are out there and put them in their books. Remember that the Federal Reserve has a private ledger that nobody sees but them, and then they have a public ledger that they allow us to see, so that we can be pacified and think that everything's all right. But in all actuality, if you have China selling off a very large portion of their debt or of their bonds that they have, U.S. bonds, which is debt, if you have Japan doing the same thing, if you have all these countries doing bilateral trading now, bypassing the U.S. dollar and joining the BRICS nations, who do you think is really buying that debt? The only one that can, which is the Federal Reserve. You even had Great Britain, I believe it was last year, have to sell off a big portion of their U.S. bonds as well. So once it comes out that the Federal Reserve has been actually the one buying all of this debt and just putting it on their books, how much confidence do you think that there is going to be in the US dollar from other countries that actually hold US dollars? It's going to be like a hot potato. They're going to try to get rid of it as soon as possible. I believe that this financial crisis that so many people have been talking about for so long is getting closer than it's ever been. When they talk about the doomsday clock hitting 90 seconds to midnight, I think what they're really talking about is the US dollar, ladies and gentlemen, because many people don't understand this, that when the US dollar goes, a lot of people are going to suffer. Maybe not so much those countries that have aligned themselves with an alternate payment system and trading system, like the countries that are joining the BRICS, along with the countries that are already in the BRICS. But many people will suffer, especially those that are exchanging or interacting now with US dollars and those that actually use US dollars as their main currency. I believe there's like 7 or 8 countries around the world that actually use the US dollar as their currency. Now let me share this with you really quick before we sign off. Your tax dollars at work, before a dime is spent on roads, Build Back Better, infrastructure, or anything else, the first $3.7 trillion of transfer payments, which is the interest, which is like Social Security, Medicare, all of the entitlements that the government puts out, has already been spent. So 3.7 trillion has already been spent. That's not considering defense. That's not considering any other type of non-discretional or discretional spending, excuse me. So ladies and gentlemen, this country is broke. And who is going to keep it running? Who is going to keep this Ponzi scheme running longer than what it already has? It's you and me. It's the taxpayers, the people that have to bear the blunt of these decisions. Because without you, the taxpayer, that interest couldn't be paid. And without that interest being paid, then people will lose, meaning countries, nations that loan money to the U.S. will lose confidence in the dollar, and they will no longer loan money to the U.S. by buying bonds. So it is we that are keeping this system alive with our tax dollars, i.e. our labor. And I wanted to point this out really quick. What does that even mean that we owe it to ourselves? So this gentleman here, Paul Krugman, I think it is. I'm not sure what his name is. He says, the debt that we create is basically money we owe to ourselves. And the burden it imposes does not involve a real transfer of resources. I have to disagree with that, because the debt that we create, ladies and gentlemen, is really not the big picture. The real burden is that we have to service that debt via interest payments, and that interest payments come from you, we the people. So those 3 numbers that I shared with you, the national debt, number 1, the interest rate that we have to pay on the national debt, number 2, and the amount of interest that we're paying, number 3, those 3 numbers, ladies and gentlemen, will affect your standard of living forever. The higher that the interest rates go, the higher that interest goes on our debt. And the debt, as long as people are willing to buy bonds, as long as the Federal Reserve continues to lend the government money by buying bonds, right, through the back door, these numbers are going to continue to go up, and the burden is going to be on we, the American people, on the taxpayers. And even if you technically don't pay taxes, you'll be paying taxes. It'll be the hidden tax of inflation, meaning that your standard of living will continue to go down. So the higher that these numbers get, the lower that your standard of living will go. And the more broke that governments get, the more tyrannical they get. They will continue to impose new taxes, right? Why do you think they want these carbon taxes, ladies and gentlemen? For real. Why do you think they want these carbon taxes? They don't care about saving the world. They need money. They are broke. And you and I, we are the cattle. Having said that, I'll sign off for now, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining in. Remember to be good to each other. When good people do good things happen. Remember to reach one, teach one, and repeat. If we all did this, the world would be a better place. And you know that it will be a better place. Many blessings to all of you and your families. God bless America. I'm Alaska Prepper. I'm out.